In the winter of 1887, Scotland Yard quietly locked away a case file that would stay sealed for more than 90 years. Inside were detailed records of 7 savage murders that haunted London's wealthy Belgravia district for 8 long months. Every victim was discovered bearing the same precise carving on the chest, along with traces of a strange substance that left their faces frozen in expressions of warped laughter. What made these crimes especially unsettling was not only how carefully they were carried out, but the repeated witness reports claimed they heard real, echoing laughter coming from the victims' homes hours after police surgeons had officially confirmed death. The investigation ended suddenly when the lead officer, Inspector Edmund Harrick, disappeared without leaving a trace. All that remained was a short, unsettling note that read, "The laughter never ends. It follows you home." Before we continue with this chilling account of London's most disturbing unsolved mystery, remember to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which country or city you're watching from. Stories like this are reminders that darkness can hide anywhere in the forgotten corners of history. What officials chose to bury was not only evidence of a killer's twisted methods, but proof of how far Victorian high society would go to protect its image, even if it meant allowing a murderer to wander freely through the fog-covered streets of the empire's capital. London in 1887 stood as the beating heart of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. That year marked Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, celebrating 50 years on the throne, with grand parades along the Mall and celebrations that stretched on for weeks. The city had never appeared more powerful or prosperous, its reach extending from tea plantations in Ceylon to diamond mines in South Africa. Gas lamps shimmered along cobbled streets like stars fallen to earth, casting restless shadows between elegant Georgian terraces and newer Victorian mansions occupied by Britain's industrial elite. The air itself seemed heavy with imperial weight, coal smoke from countless fires blending with the damp river breeze, the distant rattle of hansom cabs over stone, and the constant low murmur of a city that rarely slept. During the day, streets teemed with merchants, clerks and servants, rushing about their duties, their footsteps echoing off pale stone buildings that appeared to stretch endlessly beneath the grey English sky. After nightfall, the city changed into something far more mysterious. Gas-lit roads formed islands of yellow light surrounded by deep pools of shadow. Belgravia had risen as the most fashionable address for London's newly rich, a carefully designed neighborhood of spotless white townhouses and garden squares that reflected wealth and cultivated taste. These families were not old nobles with ancient country estates, but railway tycoons, textile barons, and shipping magnates who had made fortunes during the Industrial Revolution. Their grand homes with immaculate fronts, wrought iron balconies, and carefully trimmed gardens stood as symbols of Britain's global power and the riches it produced. The Harrington family ruled over vast cotton mills spread across Manchester and Lancashire. Thousands of workers labored in their factories, building the wealth that sustained the family name. Lord Charles Harrington, tall and commanding with steel-grey whiskers and sharp, observant eyes, had bought his Belgrave Square mansion for the staggering price of £12,000, a sum that represented not only the house itself but the social standing it provided. Lady Margaret Harrington, 20 years younger and blessed with the polished beauty of lifelong privilege, was known for hosting elaborate dinners that drew politicians, industrialists, and cultural figures from every corner of the empire. The Cavendish family, meanwhile, had accumulated their fortune through tea and opium imports from the Far East, their swift clipper ships crossing the Indian Ocean with valuable cargo that filled London warehouses and enriched their coffers. The youngest Cavendish brother, Geoffrey, inherited both wealth and a deep love for art, books, music, and especially the theatre. His Chester Square home was famous for its intimate gatherings where writers, actors, and thinkers debated the newest artistic ideas sweeping Europe. The Pemberton fortune was rooted in coal mines that riddled the hills of Wales and northern England. Their coal powered the steam engines driving Britain's industrial strength. Lord William Pemberton, once the son of a miner, had reshaped himself into one of London's most respected businessmen, though traces of his working-class accent still marked him as a newcomer among the old aristocracy. Inspector Edmund Harrick had walked these privileged streets for 15 years, climbing from an ordinary constable in the dangerous lanes of Whitechapel to one of Scotland Yard's most trusted detectives. At 45, he possessed the careful, orderly mind expected of a Victorian gentleman educated at a grammar school where Latin and Greek were taught alongside discipline and duty. Fellow officers saw him as a man able to move easily among the upper classes when needed, yet never forgetting his modest beginnings as the son of a Hampshire blacksmith. his appearance mirrored that balance. He was tall and slender, with early grey hair that lent him an air of quiet authority, while his hands remained rough from years spent at his father's forge. His dark eyes carried the steady look of someone who had witnessed humanity at its darkest yet still believed justice could prevail. Howrick lived alone in simple rooms on Montague Street near the British Museum, a lifelong bachelor devoted entirely to his work. His small sitting room was lined with books, and his only breaks from solitude came during evenings at his local pub, sharing discussions about cases with fellow officers. The autumn of 1887 arrived with unusual severity. Frost appeared in Hyde Park by early October, and thick yellow fogs rolled off the Thames, settling over the city like a choking shroud. These were not the gentle mists of poetry, but suffocating pea-soup fogs born from coal smoke mixing with river dampness. Visibility often shrank to a few yards, turning familiar streets into strange, confusing spaces where even long-time residents lost their way. On the worst nights, gas lamps seemed to float without support, their weak glow creating more shadow than light. The sound of horses' hooves on stone would rise suddenly from the haze, followed by the pale shape of a hansom cab appearing and vanishing into the gloom. It was rumored that Jack the Ripper would later use such fogs to hide his movement in the East End, though those crimes were still nearly a year away. For now, Belgravia's residents felt secure behind locked doors and uniformed servants, confident. Their wealth and position shielded them from the violence troubling poorer districts. That confidence, built on privilege, would soon prove dangerously misplaced. In the fog-bound streets of Victorian London, death could take many forms, even the sound of laughter echoing through darkness long after its source had been silenced. October 15th, 1887. The SCR Eam that shattered the quiet before dawn on Belgrave Square came from Lady Margaret Harrington. She had returned early from a charity gala at the Royal Opera House to find her front door standing ajar, allowing thick autumn fog to drift through her marble-floored entrance hall like pale fingers probing a tomb. The fog that night was especially dense, one of those smothering London pea soups that turned the familiar into something strange and threatening. Gas lamps around the square formed small pools of sickly yellow light, but beyond them stretched walls of grey-green mist that swallowed sound and distorted distance. Lady Margaret's hansom cab had been forced to crawl forward, the driver shouting warnings to unseen traffic hidden in the haze. She had left the opera early, claiming a headache, though truthfully she had grown tired of the evening, a dull Wagner performance that seemed endless. The gala was one of many obligations tied to her social rank, a chance for the wealthy to display themselves while offering polite donations to charity. She wore her finest emerald silk gown, chosen to complement her auburn hair and make her green eyes shine beneath gaslight. Yet by the second act, she longed for the quiet comfort of her drawing room and a properly brewed cup of tea. The journey home took nearly twice the usual time. Thick mist erased familiar landmarks, and street after street looked the same in the fog. Even her seasoned driver had stopped twice to read street signs beneath dim lamps to regain direction. The fog pressed against the cab windows as if alive, and Lady Margaret felt thankful for the warmth of her fur-trimmed opera cloak and the steady rhythm of hooves on stone. When they finally arrived at Belgrave Square, she sensed immediately that something was wrong. The front door of her townhouse stood slightly open, a rectangle of warm gaslight spilling into the fog like a silent invitation. Such a sight was unheard of. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the head housekeeper, was known across the household for her strict devotion to security and order. In her 23 years of loyal service, she had never once left a door unlocked, much less standing wide open to the cold London night. Lady Margaret's first thought was that something must be terribly wrong. Perhaps Mrs. Whitfield had fallen ill and required immediate medical help. The housekeeper was nearing 60 and had recently shown signs of exhaustion that came from age and a lifetime of tireless labor. Only a week earlier, she had appeared unusually distracted, often murmuring to herself as she went about her daily tasks. Other servants whispered that they had heard her carrying on animated conversations in empty rooms. Though when asked, Mrs. Whitfield merely smiled and said she was practicing her elocution exercises. As Lady Margaret climbed the stone steps to the front door, her silk evening slippers tapping softly against the damp surface, she called out in a low voice, "Mrs. Whitfield, Eleanor, are you feeling quite all right?" The thick fog seemed to absorb her words, making her own voice sound distant and strange to her ears. Inside, The gas lamps in the entrance hall flickered as the cold air rushed through the open doorway, casting restless shadows across the polished marble floor and the gilt-framed portrait. Lining the walls, Mrs. Elenina Whitfield, Harrington family's devoted housekeeper of more than 2 decades, lay stretched across the Persian rug in the main drawing room. Her body was arranged with an almost theatrical care that would haunt Lady Margaret for the rest of her life. Her silver hair, usually pulled back into a tight, severe bun that reflected her no-nonsense character, had been carefully spread around her head like a halo, each strand placed with deliberate attention. Her worn hands, which had scrubbed floors and polished silver for countless years, rested calmly over her chest in the pose of a proper Christian burial, yet it was her face that turned the scene from simple tragedy into something far more horrifying. Mrs. Whitfield's features were frozen in an expression of pure, joyful laughter. Her mouth was open wide, as if caught in a moment of absolute delight, and her eyes were crinkled with genuine mirth, the kind one might expect at a pleasant surprise. The expression looked so real that for a brief moment, Lady Margaret half expected to hear her housekeeper's familiar laugh echo through the room. The drawing-room told a very different story. Clear signs of a violent struggle surrounded the strangely peaceful body. Furniture had been knocked over. A priceless Chinese vase lay shattered beside the fireplace. Books from the mahogany shelves were scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. One heavy velvet curtain had been torn down, and Lady Margaret's delicate porcelain figurines were broken among the cushions of the horsehair sofa. Inspector Herrick arrived just as the first pale light of dawn crept through the fog, accompanied by the sounds of London waking, milk sellers calling out, the distant rumble of early traffic, and the steady rise of street noise marked the slow shift from night to day. The inspector's tall, lean figure emerged from the fog, his dark overcoat and bowler hat giving him the look of a figure from one of the popular Gothic novels of the time. The scene before him was unlike anything he had encountered in his long career at Scotland Yard, and he had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. Mrs. Whitfield's body showed unmistakable signs of a long and desperate struggle. Her fingernails were broken and filled with what appeared to be fragments of skin and dried blood from her attacker. Deep purple bruises circled her throat, and wounds along her forearms spoke of a woman who had fought fiercely to survive. And yet, her face still held that unnatural expression of joy, as though she had died while witnessing something wonderfully amusing. "Blimey, see," whispered Constable James Thornbury, Herrick's young assistant, kneeling beside the body with the pale, uneasy look of someone seeing his first truly disturbing crime scene. Thornbury was only 22, fresh from his training, and still learning to face the harsh realities of police work in Victorian London. "Just look at her face, Inspector. What kind of madman could do this? It's almost like she died laughing." Inspector Herrick moved through the room with calm precision, examining every detail like a careful scientist recording evidence. Each overturned chair, each scattered book, each shattered ornament told part of the story of Mrs. Whitfield's final moments. He paid close attention to the position of the body, the careful styling of the hair, and the neatly folded hands. All of it suggested that the killer had spent a considerable amount of time with the victim after her death, arranging the scene to create the greatest possible psychological impact. Just below the left collarbone, the killer had carved a small but exact symbol into her chest. It was a theatrical mask showing both comedy and tragedy combined into one disturbing image, the sort seen in the Grand Theatre of the West End, where London's elite gathered to enjoy the works of Shaw, Wilde, and other celebrated playwrights. The wound was shallow and clearly inflicted after death. Its clean edges showed intention rather than rage. This was not meant to kill, but to sign the crime, a deliberate calling left behind by someone who planned carefully. What troubled Inspector Herrick the most, however, was the strange scent hanging in the air. It was not the familiar smell of death he had come to expect, but something almost medicinal, with a faint sweetness that reminded him of the ether used by surgeons at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Even so, it was more complex than that, layered and carefully blended, suggesting deep knowledge of chemicals and their effects. He had encountered a similar odor years earlier in a case involving a disgraced doctor who had performed illegal experiments with anesthetics on charity patients at Bethlehem Royal Hospital. That case had ended in suicide and the destruction of the man's research, but the memory of those strange smells had never fully left him. This scent was different, more refined, pointing to someone with advanced understanding of chemistry and pharmacology. Lady Margaret Harrington, still wrapped in her opera cloak and trembling despite the warmth of the coal fire, could offer little helpful information. I returned from the Royal Opera House shortly after midnight, she said in her refined accent, her voice barely steady. We attended a charity gala. It was a dreadful performance of Wagner's Ring Cycle, if I'm honest. I claimed a headache and left early, around 11. She paused, pressing a lace handkerchief embroidered with her family crest to her eyes. Ella should have been in bed hours before. She would always strict a bow at her schedule, retiring at exactly 10 after checking that every door was locked and every gas light extinguished. She served our family even before my marriage to Lord Charles and never once broke her routine. What Lady Margaret could not explain, and what would later become one of the most unsettling parts of the case, was a detail shared quietly by several neighbors in the days that followed. Mrs. Gertrude Pembroke, who lived across the square, claimed she heard a woman's laughter coming from the Harrington house well after 2 in the morning. This was hours after the police surgeon estimated Mrs. Whitfield's time of death to be between 11:30 and midnight. It was the strangest thing, Inspector, Mrs. Pembroke explained when Harrick visited her the next afternoon. She was a stout woman in her 60s, the widow of a successful barrister, comfortably settled in one of Belgravia's finest homes. I was reading in my sitting room. I suffer from insomnia, you see, and rarely sleep before dawn. The fog was so thick I could barely see across the square, but sound carries in a peculiar way on such nights. She shifted in her velvet chair, nervously twisting the fringe of her shawl. At first I thought Lady Margaret had guests. The upper classes do keep odd hours after the theatre, but this laughter was different. It lasted nearly an hour, the same woman laughing again and again with such joy. It almost made me smile. Still, there was something deeply unsettling about it. Something that made me draw my curtains and try to forget it. The first victim had fallen to the figure the newspapers would soon name the Laughing Man. His identity and purpose remained hidden, as mysterious as the fog that rolled through the gaslit streets of Victorian London. Inspector Harrick soon realized he was facing more than a murder. He was confronting a riddle that challenged logic, reason, and the limits of scientific understanding. Word of the brutal crime spread through Belgravia's social circles like wildfire, leaving fear and fascination in its wake. Despite the Harrington family's frantic efforts to keep matters quiet and shield their respected name from the stain of scandal, within just a few days, the drawing rooms and private gentlemen's clubs of London's upper class were alive with hushed gossip about the unfortunate event at the Harrington home. Each whispered retelling added fresh details and strange theories, most of which had little connection to what had truly happened. The Times, always careful to protect the sensibilities of respectable society, printed only a short and cautiously phrased notice about a domestic tragedy in Belgrave Square. It offered just enough information to satisfy public curiosity while avoiding lurid elements that might upset polite readers. The brief item, tucked away on page 6 between advertisements for patent medicines and announcements of charitable gatherings, simply reported that Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a long-time servant in the household of Lord and Lady Harrington, had been FRU. ND dead under circumstances now under investigation by the Metropolitan Police. The cheaper penny papers, however, wasted no time in exploiting the story with the usual Victorian hunger for scandal and dark sensationalism. The Illustrated Police News, famous for its shocking woodcut images and excited writing, splashed the case across its front page under the dramatic headline, "Mysterious Death in Belgravia, Servant Found with Ghastly Smile." The illustration, while wildly wrong in many details, still captured something unsettling about the crime and helped fix the case firmly in the public imagination. Inspector Harrick soon found himself balancing on a fragile political rope that demanded every ounce of his tact and understanding of Victorian social order. The Harrington family held serious power within London's ruling circles. Lord Charles Harrington was not only a member of the House of Lords but also a wealthy investor in railways throughout the empire and a close friend to several members of Parliament. One careless word from him could destroy a police career in disgrace, or just as easily lift an ambitious officer into the higher ranks of Scotland Yard and a secure pension. Yet Harrick's sense of justice, sharpened by 15 years working in London's harshest districts, would not allow a shallow investigation simply because of social standing. He had seen far too many cases where money and privilege bought silence and allowed the guilty to walk free. Mrs. Whitfield, thou Only a servant in society's eyes deserved the same careful investigation as any noblewoman. The inspector's early inquiries into Mrs. Whitfield's past revealed a woman who had lived a model life of duty and loyalty. Born Elenina Caldwell in a small Yorkshire village, she had arrived in London at 18, determined to find work in one of the city's grand houses. Through diligence, sharp intelligence, and a natural grasp of the complicated rules that governed Victorian households, she had climbed steadily from scullery maid to head housekeeper over 20 years. Other servants in the Harrington home spoke of her with real warmth and respect. Sarah Pembroke, the young scullery maid whose shaken manner reflected the shock of finding her superior's body, described a woman who was both strict and kind. "She was always fair with us," Sarah explained softly, twisting her stiff white apron between nervous fingers. "She never raised her voice without reason and was always ready to show you the right way to do things if you truly wanted to learn." Thomas Hartwell, the family butler and Mrs. Whitfield's closest colleague among the staff, described someone who took deep pride in her duties and had devoted her entire adult life to keeping the household running smoothly. "She knew every inch of this house, Inspector," he said, his formal posture easing slightly as he spoke of her. "Every piece of silver, every plate of china, every family custom and social obligation." Lady Margaret trusted her completely, as did Lord Charles. She was more than a servant. She was the heart of this household, yet despite these glowing accounts, the servant also mentioned that Mrs. Whitfield had behaved oddly in the weeks before her death. Several spoke of her growing habit of holding what seemed to be long conversation with people no one else could see as she went about her duties. "She always had a dramatic streak," said Sarah Pembroke, her voice growing steadier as she continued. "Sometimes we'd hear her in the pantry or the wine cellar doing different voices, like she was acting for an invisible audience. Different characters, you know. One moment she'd sound like a refined lady, all polished and grand, then suddenly switch to a rough working accent, or an Irish lilt, or even a Scottish tone. It made us laugh, hearing her practice all those ways of speaking. This theatrical habit caught Inspector Herrick's attention, especially when considered alongside the carved theatrical mask on the victim's chest and the strange smile locked on her face in death. A pattern seemed to be forming, though its meaning was still uncertain. Mrs. Whitfield's fascination with performance, her habit of trying on voices and roles, and the killer's dramatic signature all hinted at a link to London's lively theatre world. Herrick chose to widen his investigation into that realm, starting with the Grand West End playhouses, where society's elite gathered to watch new works by famous writers like Oscar Wilde, L.D.E. George Bernard Shaw, and a rising group of realistic dramatists who were unsettling Victorian values with blunt portrayals of social issues. In 1887, the West End was a close community where rumors traveled quickly among actors, managers, directors, and theatre owners who made their living pleasing London's appetite for drama. The Lyceum Theatre, under the famous Henry Irving, stood at the height of theatrical prestige, while newer houses like the Savoy experimented with electric lighting and other innovations that promised to change the stage forever. During these inquiries, Herrick first heard murmurs of a strange figure who regularly attended both music halls and serious theatres. He was described as a well-dressed gentleman who always came alone, never spoke to anyone yet, sometimes laughed with disturbing intensity at moments when laughter felt entirely wrong. Several managers reported complaints from audience members unsettled by his reactions, especially during scenes of death, grief, or emotional climax. "Gave me chills, something awful about him," confided Albert Grimby, manager of the Lyceum Theatre, as he guided Inspector Herrick through the empty building on a dull November afternoon. The huge auditorium, stripped of its evening sparkle, felt ghost-like in the weak daylight slipping through tall windows. This gentleman, and he was clearly a gentleman from his clothes and manner, sat in the same box seat 3 nights in a row during our run of Macbeth. Every time someone died on stage, every time Lady Macbeth delivered one of her mad speeches, he laughed. Not a quiet chuckle or polite amusement, but deep, booming laughter that echoed through the whole house. Grimby stopped, still unsettled by the memory. Other patrons complained, said it spoiled the performance. Mr. Irving noticed it from the stage and was not pleased at all. We finally asked the man not to return. He accepted it with surprising good cheer, said he understood completely, and even praised us for what he called our authentic portrayal of mortality's absurdity. His exact words, Inspector, not something you expect from an ordinary theatergoer. When Herrick pressed staff for clearer descriptions, the accounts differed wildly, often contradicting one another. Some recalled a tall man with dark hair and a bold mustache like a fashionable army officer. Others remembered a shorter, clean-shaven figure with the pale look of a scholar or professional. The only details that remained consistent were his expensive evening clothes that marked him as upper class, his uncanny knowledge of each performance as if he knew the scripts in advance, and that chilling habit of laughing, at moments meant to evoke sorrow or fear. 3 weeks after Mrs. Whitfield's murder, as London's fog thickened, with the coming winter and gas lamps burned like desperate stars against the dark, the killer struck again. This time the victim was Mr. Geoffrey Cavendish, younger brother of the powerful tea-importing family, found dead in his private study in Chester Square, under circumstances both familiar and disturbingly different. He was discovered by his manservant, a nervous young fellow named William Hartley, who had been in his service for less than 6 months. Hartley arrived at his usual hour of 7 to light the fires and prepare breakfast, only to find the study door locked from inside, and no reply to his frantic knocking. A locksmith was finally summoned by the cook, and when the door was forced open, the scene within burned itself into their minds. Mr. Geoffrey Cavendish sat upright in his favorite leather armchair beside the fireplace, where he spent his evenings reading and writing letters. He wore his burgundy velvet smoking jacket, and at first glance appeared merely asleep, his head resting back against the high chair, and his hands placed calmly on the armrests. But, as with Mrs. Whitfield, his face was fixed in that same terrible expression of joyful, unrestrained laughter, a smile that seemed to mock death itself. The study itself told a very different story from the first crime scene, where Mrs. Whitfield had died during a brutal struggle that left the Harrington drawing room torn apart. Mr. Cavendish, by contrast, seemed to have passed away calmly, almost as if he had simply given in to an overpowering burst of laughter while reading. The room was perfectly neat, with every book still in its proper place on the tall mahogany shelves that covered the walls from floor to ceiling. A leather-bound book rested open across the dead man's lap. It was a volume of comic plays by the modern playwright Oscar Wilde, open to a scene from The Importance of Being Earnest. The irony was impossible to ignore. Inspector Herrick immediately noticed that the visible passage contained Lady Bracknell's famous remark about maintaining proper behavior in the face of life's difficulties, yet the most unsettling detail, the one that would trouble Inspector Herrick for many months, came from the other residents of Chester Square, who had been awakened during the night by strange sounds coming from the Cavendish house. Mrs. Adelaide Pittin, an elderly widow living in the adjoining townhouse, reported hearing laughter echoing through the walls where past 3 in the morning, long after the time when the police surgeon later confirmed that Mr. Cavendish had already been dead. Medical examination placed his death sometime between 10 and 11 the previous evening. It was the strangest thing, Mrs. Pittin explained when Inspector Herrick interviewed her the next day. She was a dignified woman in her 70s, the widow of a successful shipping merchant who had left her comfortably settled in one of London's most prestigious addresses. "The walls between our houses are quite thick," she said. "They were designed to give proper privacy to families of standing, and yet I could hear this gentleman's laughter as clearly as if he were sitting right in my own drawing room." She paused, to pour tea from an ornate silver service, her hands shaking slightly, whether from age or unease it was hard to say. "What disturbed me most, Inspector, was how long it went on. This was not a brief chuckle from reading something amusing. The laughter lasted for hours, sometimes stopping for a few minutes and then starting again, louder and more intense than before. I finally took a sleeping powder around 4 in the morning, but even then the sound followed me into my dreams." Inspector Herrick's investigation into Geoffrey Cavendish's life revealed a man who moved in worlds completely separate from Mrs. Whitfield, which only deepened the mystery linking the two deaths. Cavendish was a gentleman of private wealth, educated at Cambridge University, where he studied classics and literature before inheriting a considerable fortune from his family's tea importing business. Unlike his older brother Marcus, who ran the commercial side of the enterprise with cold efficiency, Geoffrey chose a life devoted to intellectual and cultural pursuits. He was a familiar figure in London's theatre circles and was widely known in the West End as a generous patron of new playwrights and experimental productions. His house in Chester Square was well known in artistic society for its small salons, held twice a week, where writers, actors, critics, and thinkers gathered to debate the newest artistic ideas spreading across Europe. Oscar Wilde himself had often attended, along with George Bernard Shaw, the Controversial Irish dramatist whose realistic plays challenged Victorian values with their blunt treatment of social issues. Candish never married, preferring to give his life entirely to learning and aesthetic pleasure. His private library held more than 3,000 books on subjects ranging from ancient literature to the latest scientific works on human psychology and behavior. Among his friends, he was especially known for his interest in the new theory, exploring the link between the mind and physical expression. Despite Inspector Herrick's increasingly urgent efforts, the connection between Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Candish remained frustratingly unclear. She was a working-class woman who had spent her life serving others. He was an educated gentleman who moved among London's cultural elite. Their paths should never have crossed, and yet both had been killed by the same careful hand. Both were left with that disturbing look of joy on their faces, and both had somehow continued laughing long after death. It was Constable Thornbury, still keen to prove himself despite his lingering discomfort with violent scenes, who made the discovery that finally pushed the case forward. While searching Candish's study under Inspector Herrick's watchful eye, the young constable noticed that the wooden panel behind the large desk did not sit quite right. Closer inspection revealed a hidden compartment containing several items that cast the entire investigation in a new light. Inside was a small leather diary, its pages filled with Geoffrey Candish's neat handwriting, recording his growing obsession with what he described as the true expression of human emotion. The diary entries, covering the previous 6 months, showed a man who had become increasingly convinced that most displays of feeling were nothing more than social performances, shaped to meet Victorian expectations rather than to reflect genuine inner experience. One entry dated June 3, 1887 was especially revealing. Attended the Petons' dinner party this evening. Observed Mrs. Harrington's housekeeper, a woman of remarkable theatrical sensitivity. While serving the soup, she showed what appeared to be genuine amusement at Lady Peaton's story about her troubles with the new cook. Unlike the polite and controlled laughter of the guests, this woman's response felt entirely real, untouched by social rules. Would be most interested to observe her reactions under more controlled conditions. Another entry, written just 2 weeks before Candish's death, was far more troubling. Have made contact with Dr. H regarding the experiments we discussed. He has agreed to assist in our inquiry into the chemical creation of authentic emotional states. Early compounds show extraordinary promise in overriding the social conditioning that suppresses true human response. If we succeed, we shall finally witness pure, unrestrained emotion in its natural form. But it was the final entry, written only 2 days before his death, that sent a cold shiver through Inspector Herrick as he read it by the flickering gaslight. The work begins tomorrow night. Dr. H has perfected the compound that will allow us to observe genuine human emotion stripped of all social disguise. I have volunteered as the first subject, certain that my scientific curiosity will overcome any temporary discomfort. If this succeeds, we shall at last understand what exists beneath the masks worn in polite society. The diary made it clear that Geoffrey Candish had not been a helpless victim, but a willing participant in a dreadful experiment that had ended in disaster. The question remained, who was this mysterious Dr. H mentioned again and again, and what exactly were these chemical compounds capable of producing such extreme emotion while also causing death? Inspector Herrick's thoughts raced as the implications became clear. If Candish had offered himself willingly, then Mrs. Whitfield's death could not be dismissed as random. Perhaps she too had been connected to these experiments in ways not yet understood. The theatrical details, the carved masks, the frozen smiles, and the laughter that echoed hours after death all pointed to someone with deep knowledge of both chemistry and the human mind. Beneath the diary, Constable Thornbury uncovered a bundle of letters that offered further insight. Written in a refined hand and signed only with the letter H, they discussed complex formulas and theories about the link between consciousness and emotional expression. One letter, dated 3 months earlier, stood out. My dear Candish, it read, your observations on the artificial nature of social emotions support my own studies into the chemical foundation of human feeling. I believe we are close to a discovery that could transform our understanding of consciousness itself. The compounds I have developed can bypass the social training that restrains authentic response, allowing us to observe pure emotion in its natural state. However, I must warn you that the effects are not yet fully known, and the dosage must be calculated with absolute precision to prevent unintended results. As Inspector Herrick continued reading, A picture began to form of a deliberate and methodical series of experiments, something far more calculated and disturbing than simple murder. Someone with deep knowledge of chemistry and psychology had been carrying out research on how human emotions could be controlled, using the unaware people of London as test subjects. The dramatic details were not random marks left behind, but carefully selected symbols meant to represent the false nature of social performance compared to real emotional expression. Just when it seemed nothing more could shock us, the terror spreading through London's most fashionable district grew even stronger. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who enjoys dark mysteries. Tap the like button to support our work, and remember to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Now let us uncover together what happens next in this twisted Victorian London tale. Inspector Herrick slowly realized, with rising dread, that he was not chasing a series of random killings, but uncovering organized human experiment, led by someone with advanced expertise in chemistry and psychology. This discovery completely changed his view of the case. He was no longer tracking an ordinary murderer, but hunting a figure who resembled a mad scientist, turning London's citizens into unwilling laboratory subjects. His investigation into Geoffrey Candish's academic connections drew him into the dark and unsettling world of Victorian pseudoscience and experimental medicine. London in 1887 was overflowing with new scientific ideas and bold theories, where serious research often mixed with fraud and ambitious men crossed ethical lines in the name of progress and recognition. Candish had belonged to several intellectual societies that gathered in the private rooms of elite gentlemen's clubs across London. The Arnhem Club, with its grand neoclassical front facing Palm Mall, functioned as a meeting place for the Royal Geographic Society and attracted many of the empire's most respected thinkers and scholars. However, it was the smaller and more secretive groups that truly caught Inspector Herrick's attention. Societies such as the Society for Psychical Research and the London Anthropological Institute were places where radical ideas about human behavior and consciousness were argued with intense passion. Among the frequent participants was Dr. Sebastian Hartwell, a former doctor who had lost his medical license 3 years earlier after being accused of carrying out illegal experiments on patients at Bethlehem Royal Hospital, the feared Benham Asylum, where London's mentally ill were kept in brutal conditions that would have shocked even hardened Victorians. Dr. Hartwell's downfall had been dramatic and widely discussed in medical publications of the time. Once praised as one of London's brightest young physicians, with a fashionable practice on Harley Street and a reputation for bold treatments of nervous conditions, he had slowly grown fixated on how mental states showed themselves physically. His studies focused heavily on facial expressions linked to extreme emotions, and he began promoting dangerous theories about chemically triggering specific psychological responses. Hartwell was undeniably brilliant, explained Professor Marcus Rothel of University College London when Inspector Herrick finally met him in his cluttered Gower Street office. Rothel, a respected figure in the emerging field of experimental psychology, had known Hartwell during their student years at Edinburgh University, but he had no moral limits when it came to research. He truly believed that scientific advancement demanded experiments that ignored traditional ethics. The professor paused to wipe his glasses. Cleo, why disturbed by memories of his former colleagues' descent into obsession, Hartwell often spoke of creating chemical compounds capable of producing precise emotional states while keeping the subject awake and aware. He was especially fascinated by joy and laughter, convinced that true happiness was the hardest emotion to manufacture artificially. His aim was to achieve what he described as a pure emotional state, free from social influence and conscious restraint. When Inspector Herrick tried to locate Dr. Hartwell, he discovered the man had vanished from his modest Bloomsbury lodgings weeks early, leaving behind only unsettling notebooks packed with detailed drawing of facial muscles and complex chemical formulas seemingly designed to affect the human nervous system. The landlady, Mrs. Agnes Butterworth, told the inspector that her tenant had carried out strange experiments in his rooms, often working late into the night with chemical equipment that filled the boarding house with unusual smells. A very odd gentleman, Mrs. Butterworth said as she guided Inspector Herrick through the now empty rooms that had served as both laboratory and living space. Always polite and paid his rent on time, but there were those strange odors at all hours, sweet chemical smells that made your eyes sting, and sometimes sounds like someone rehearsing speeches or acting out performances. The rooms themselves revealed disturbing proof of the scale of Hartwell's work. Behind a hidden wall, Inspector Herrick uncovered a fully equipped chemical laboratory complete with glass retorts, heating tools, and countless bottles filled with powders and liquids. Even more alarming were the notes describing experiments with different chemical mixtures and their effects on human subjects, though the identities of those subjects were never mentioned. One notebook included exact measurements and observations that sent a chill through the inspector. The subject shows uncontrollable laughter about 15 minutes after administration. Expression intensifies over the next 30 minutes, reaching peak euphoria at around 45 minutes. The subject remains conscious but cannot control facial muscles or voice. The effect continues for roughly 6 hours after vital functions cease, suggesting the compound alters the nervous system at a fundamental level. The inspector's urgency grew when reports emerged that several more members of Belgravia's upper class had experienced disturbing incidents. Lady Victoria Pitton, a widow living near the Candish home, found clear signs that someone had entered her house while she was away the previous week. Nothing had been taken, yet objects had been moved and rearranged in a way that suggested careful searching. It was deeply unsettling, Inspector Lady Pitton said, while pouring tea in her refined morning room overlooking Chester Square. I returned from visiting my sister in Brighton to find my private papers disturbed. Nothing was missing, but my desk had been searched and my letters read. Most troubling of all, several books were gone, all about theatre and emotional expression. Lord Hamilton Fairfax, whose Eaton Square mansion held one of London's finest private libraries, described a similar break-in. His study had been entered and thoroughly searched, but with strange precision. The man knew exactly what he wanted, Lord Fairfax told Inspector Herrick. He ignored priceless first editions and rare manuscripts worth a fortune. Instead, he took only books on psychology, anatomy, and theatrical performance. Very strange behavior for a burglar. Yet it was Mrs. Charlotte Bramwell's account that offered the most terrifying insight into the killer's careful planning. The widow of a successful solicitor, she lived mostly alone in a grand townhouse on Belgravia Square, directly opposite the Harrington residence where the first murder had taken place. For 2 weeks, she had noticed a well-dressed man watching her house from across the street, always vanishing when she tried to see him clearly. He wasn't watching like a thief, she told the inspector, her voice shaking with fear. It felt like he was studying the house, making notes. I began to feel less like a woman and more like a specimen under examination. Mrs. Bramwell's description matched reports from theatre managers about a strange audience member who laughed at the wrong moments during serious performances. A tall, sharply dressed man with the posture of someone educated, yet with something deeply unsettling in his presence, leaving others uneasy without knowing exactly why. Inspector Herrick slowly came to understand that all of these people, Lady Pitton, Lord Fairfax, and Mrs. Bramwell, shared one critical link that sent a chill through him. Each of them had attended the same set of lectures on the science of human expression delivered by Dr. Sebastian Hartwell at the Royal Institution earlier that year, before his work was exposed and his medical license was taken away. The situation grew even darker when Herrick learned that both Mrs. Whitfield and Geoffrey Candish had also been present at those lectures. Mrs. Whitfield, even though she was only a servant, had somehow managed to gain entry to the scientific talks, while Candish was known as a frequent and enthusiastic attendee who often stayed behind to question the doctor in long conversations after each lecture ended. The lectures themselves had been promoted as a look into the newest scientific ideas about human emotion and how feelings appeared physically in the body, attracting members of London's intellectual and cultural upper circles. Dr. Hartwell used this respected platform to explain his ideas about real versus false emotional expression, insisting that human emotions were nothing more than social performances rather than true inner experiences. According to reports published in the newspapers, Dr. Hartwell had been especially convincing when he argued that a true scientific understanding of human nature required emotions to be studied in their raw, untouched state. He even suggested that certain chemical substances could be created to bypass social training and expose genuine emotional reactions hidden beneath polite behavior. What none of those listening had realized was that Dr. Hartwell was not simply talking about ideas. He was quietly describing a plan for human experimentation that he intended to carry out, using members of his own audience as unknowing test subjects. The killer was not selecting victims at random. He was carefully moving through a list of people who had shown interest in his unsettling theories about controlling human emotion. As winter settled in and the London fog grew thicker, turning gas-lit streets into twisting paths of shadow and doubt, Inspector Harrick found himself racing against time to protect possible victims, while hunting a murderer who understood the human mind in ways that went far beyond normal police experience. The case had become something much more than a simple murder inquiry. It was now a desperate effort to stop a pattern of organized human experimentation carried out by someone who viewed other people as nothing more than tools for research. Harrick's investigation revealed that Dr. Hartwell had been planning his experiments for many months, slowly selecting subjects who had shown interest in his work and carefully collecting information about their routines, movements, and weaknesses. The dramatic details, the carved masks, the frozen smiles of laughter, and the strange sounds of joy heard after death were not random calling cards. They were carefully designed symbols meant to support his claims about the false nature of social emotion. Each killing was not just an act of cruelty, but a deliberate scientific display meant to prove the doctor's beliefs about genuine emotional expression. The victims were not dying from ordinary physical violence, but from chemical mixtures that created intense pleasure, while also triggering deadly reactions in the body. The laughter that continued long after death was not a ghostly mystery, but proof of drugs that affect the nervous system so deeply that their influence lingered even after the brain had ceased to function. Inspector Harrick understood that he was facing an enemy who combined the cold planning of a scientist with the disturbed mind of a serial killer. Dr. Hartwell was not simply killing people. He was performing organized research into human consciousness, using murder as his method and London's elite as unwilling test subjects. The breakthrough that finally pushed the investigation forward came from an unexpected person, a young medical student named Thomas Whitmore. Whitmore had attended Dr. Hartwell's lectures and had grown increasingly uneasy about the path the disgraced doctor was taking. At first, he had been fascinated by Hartwell's ideas about emotional truth and had even offered to help with what he believed would be harmless psychological studies. "I truly believed we were involved in proper scientific research," Whitmore explained when he finally gathered the courage to contact Scotland Yard after reading about the Cavendish murder in the morning papers. Dr. Hartwell spoke passionately about expanding our understanding of human consciousness, and I felt honored to be invited to assist him. But as the war continued, I began to see that we were crossing moral lines that no responsible scientist should ever cross. Whitmore's testimony exposed the full scale of Dr. Hartwell's operation. From a hidden laboratory in the basement of an abandoned warehouse near the London docks, the former physician had been creating increasingly advanced chemical compounds designed to control human emotion and awareness. His final aim was to produce what he called pure emotional experience, feelings so strong and genuine that they went beyond the social rules that controlled everyday human behavior. He had developed several different formulas, Whitmore continued, his voice trembling as he remembered what he had seen. Some chemicals caused overwhelming fear, others brought deep sadness, but his greatest success was a compound that created uncontrollable happiness. He called it his essence of joy and claimed it could expose the true meaning of human happiness by removing all artificial limits. Whitmore's description of the laboratory matched what Inspector Harrick had already found in Dr. Hartwell's deserted rooms, but on a much larger and more disturbing scale. The basement workshop held enough equipment to produce large amounts of chemical substances, along with detailed records of experiments carried out on dozens of subjects over many months. Most of the early test subjects had been volunteers from medical schools and workhouses, Whitmore said. Dr. Hartwell convinced them they were helping with real research that could benefit humanity, and many of them were desperate for the small payments he offered. They trusted him because of his medical title and reputation, never understanding the true danger of what they had agreed to. As the experiments grew more extreme and deadly, Dr. Hartwell had been forced to look for unwilling subjects among London's wealthy classes. Those who attended his Royal Institution lectures were ideal. They were intelligent enough to appreciate the scientific language he used, and important enough that their deaths would draw public attention. Whitmore recalled that Hartwell often spoke about the need to force the scientific world to accept his ideas. By experimenting on well-known members of society, he believed he could no longer be ignored. Each death was meant to serve as both proof of his theories and a direct challenge to traditional views of the human mind. The idea that Dr. Hartwell was using murder as a way of publishing his research horrified Inspector Harrick, but it also gave him valuable clues about where the killer might be hiding. Whitmore provided clear directions to the warehouse laboratory and shared details about Hartwell's daily habits and movements. Then, on a fog-filled evening late in December, when thick yellow mist from the Thames reduced visibility to only a few steps, and distant ship horns echoed sadly across the water, Inspector Howrick received the message he had both expected and feared. A street boy delivered a finely written envelope to his rooms, bearing an invitation written in Dr. Hartwell's unmistakable educated handwriting. N.G. My dear Inspector Howrick, the letter began, your investigation has been thorough and admirable, though you have sadly misunderstood the true purpose of my work. I am not an ordinary criminal, but a scientist seeking knowledge that will forever change our understanding of human consciousness. If you wish to witness the final result of my research and truly grasp what I have achieved, I invite you to meet me at the Adelphi Theatre at midnight tonight. Come alone and prepare to observe the most genuine expression of human emotion ever recorded. Your investigation ends this evening, as does your narrow view of what it truly means to be human. Inspector Howrick knew immediately that it was a trap, carefully designed to make him the last subject in Dr. Hartwell's terrible experiments. But 3 months of failed leads had left him with few choices, and his duty would not allow him to turn away while lives were still at risk. He arranged for backup officers to follow from a distance, armed himself with his service revolver and a small vial of smelling salts that might help counter chemical effects, and stepped into the fog-filled streets toward what he believed would be his final encounter with the Laughing Man. The Adelphi Theatre loomed dark and silent on the Strand, its grand, neoclassical front casting strange shadows under weak gas lamps struggling against the fog. The stage door stood open, and Inspector Howrick moved through empty hallways lined with old theatre posters that told stories of performances that had entertained London crowds for generations. The building seemed to breathe with ghost-like memories of thousands of old performances, the air itself heavy with the layered emotions of countless actors and silent spectators. As he moved toward the main auditorium, Inspector Howrick heard voices drifting from the stage. It was not the single voice he had expected, but something closer to a discussion between several people. The realization that Dr. Hartwell was not alone sent a cold shiver down the inspector's spine, as he understood that the conspiracy before him might be far wider than he had first believed. He saw them on the stage, lit by a low calcium light that threw sharp shadows across the ornate proscenium arch. Dr. Sebastian Hartwell stood at center stage like a lecturer addressing an unseen crowd. Beside him stood a man who was very much alive, despite official reports claiming otherwise. Geoffrey Cavendish, the younger Cavendish brother, had not been murdered at all. He had been a willing partner in Dr. Hartwell's experiments from the very start. Inspector Howrick. Dr. Hartwell called out, his voice carrying easily through the empty theatre with a practiced P. Rejection of a man used to commanding large audiences. How remarkably punctual of you to attend our final performance. Please, take a seat in the front row. You will want a clear view, as what you are about to witness is the result of many years of careful scientific work into the nature of true human emotion. The truth, when it finally emerged during Dr. Hartwell's long explanation, was far more disturbing than Inspector Howrick had dared to imagine. The former physician and Geoffrey Cavendish had been working together for more than 2 years on a detailed program of human experimentation meant to create and observe genuine emotional states under controlled conditions. What began as theoretical debates about the artificial quality of social emotion had slowly turned into organized murder disguised as research. The elegance of our method, Inspector, lies in its accuracy and control, Cavendish explained, speaking with the cold academic calm of a university lecturer discussing an unusual specimen. We have successfully created chemical compounds that can produce any emotional state we choose, while leaving the subject fully conscious and aware. Mrs. Whitfield died while experiencing pure, unfiltered joy, not the polite happiness expected in society, but true euphoria, free from any outside cause. Dr. Hartwell stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his movements sharp and deliberate, like a surgeon preparing for a careful procedure. Each subject has given us priceless information about how extreme emotions appear in the body. We have charted the precise facial muscle movements linked to real terror, genuine sorrow, and our greatest success, pure joy untouched by social training. The continued sounds heard after clinical death prove that our compound reach levels of consciousness deeper than anyone previously believed possible. Inspector Howrick now understood the meaning of the theatrical mask carved into each victim's chest. It symbolized Dr. Hartwell's belief that ordinary human emotion was nothing more than an act, a social mask worn to satisfy the expectations of polite society. Only through chemical intervention, he believed, could true feeling be exposed, stripped of the artificial limits imposed by proper Victorian behavior. But you have made one critical mistake in your investigation, Inspector. Dr. Hartwell continued, his tone shifting to that of a professor correcting a capable but misguided student. You assumed we chose our subjects at random from among my lecture attendees. In truth, every death was carefully planned to create the ideal conditions for our final experiment. The creation of real terror in someone who believes he is fully in control. The full horror of the trap became clear as Dr. Hartwell revealed that Inspector Herrick had not discovered their lair through clever police work. He had been guided, step by step, into becoming the final subject in their series of experiments. Every clue, every witness statement, every piece of evidence had been deliberately placed to bring him to this moment. In this exact place, your colleagues at Scotland Yard have been delayed by our associates and will not be arriving to assist you, Geoffrey Candish added with casual cruelty. We needed a subject of unusual intelligence and emotional discipline for our last demonstration, and your reputation for careful investigation made you the ideal choice. Your final moments will offer priceless data on the physical effects of extreme fear in a trained professional used to danger. Dr. Hartwell raised a small glass vial filled with a clear liquid that seemed to glow faintly under the harsh calcium light. This compound represents the peak of our research, Inspector. Unlike the substance used to induce joy in our earlier subjects, this one will allow you to experience pure, concentrated terror while remaining fully conscious and aware of every sensation. Your death will complete our understanding of authentic human emotion. But Inspector Herrick had survived 15 years of police work in London's most dangerous districts by never underestimating his enemies and always keeping more than one escape plan. As Dr. Hartwell stepped down from the stage with Geoffrey Candish close behind, the inspector pretended to accept.